I would now like to invite Professor Danny Quah, Lee Ka-shing Professor of Economics at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, for a speech on the Liberalisation Delusion. Professor Quah, please.
Mr. Tan, Professor Wang, Dean Kishore, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk to you this afternoon about my own take on reframing the world. And although I'm a technical economist by day, I want to talk to you about reframing the world in terms of how we engage one with the other. Although it might seem abstract, it probably is. So I need to begin by telling you a little bit about myself. I was born, I grew up in Southeast Asia. But after secondary school here, I was fortunate enough to go study in the United States. There in the West, I learned universal models. And by universal models, I don't mean systems of mathematical equations to manipulate and analyze. I mean something perhaps more fundamental, something more profoundly powerful. Universal models are rules of engagement by which individuals in society, large groups within society, large forces within society deal with one another, how we engage with one another. These are universal because they transcend the specifics of geographies and time. And these are models because they are aspirational. They describe successes. They are guides to behavior, not just for individuals, but they're guides to behavior for entire nation states. Guides to behavior for how nation states organize their domestic polities. Guides to nation states for how they deal with one another in geographical neighborhoods. I want to talk about liberalization as a way of thinking about these rules of engagement. Okay. I want to talk to you about abstract principles and concrete imperatives. And I want to do both by telling you some of the experience I had while I was studying there in the West. As we went through these rules of engagement, these universal models, some of my classmates would now and then get up and say, why is it that if these rules of engagement are so universal, all the examples that we study are based on the United States? Why is it all the challenges and problems that we solve with these rules of engagement are American ones? And the answer we got was very simple. What is good for America is good for the world. And this is important for at least two reasons. One is that America has succeeded where no other nation state different from America has been able to come close. But the second, more interesting message embedded in this, what is good for America is good for the world, is that you can think about social systems, rules of engagement, where incentives are aligned. What America wants to do is what the world wants America to do. What is good for America is good for the world. Okay. And these were profound lessons that I took away from these learned establishments. The concrete implications include, among other things, that America, the West, the system by which we organized daily engagement, one person with the next, the system by which we organized the domestic polity, the system by which America organized its foreign policy, was the endpoint of humanity's ideological evolution. There was nowhere else to go. All other governmental systems had been tried and had been found wanting. They were flawed. They were riddled with irrationalities and contradictions. The American liberal democratic system, combined with free market capitalism, was the only one history had shown to be free of these contradictions. The ideals of liberal democracy, free market capitalism, organized around liberty, openness, open systems, embedded with individual empowerment, that was the only way, the only rational way to think about the future of the world. There was no point reframing the world because we had arrived. Okay? It was impossible in some of this thinking to imagine worlds that were radically different and yet better off. And therefore, the question about reframing the world is nonsensical. You do not need to reframe the world because this is the best that we will find. Now, if you think about that for a second, it's a wonderful vision because it says what you have to do to make your countries, your systems, your societies work is to construct a liberal, free, open system with individual empowerment, and then you step back and you let the system run. It was magical. As an automatic system with feedbacks built into the laws of motion. And all you had to do was to let the system run. There were some people who misread, I think, the idea that by doing well for yourself, you do good for society in an open, free system with individual empowerment. They read that as a statement that Gordon Gekko took to Wall Street. It is not that. It is that if you construct a free, open system and you provide individual empowerment, the system automatically takes you to the best system, the best outcome that is possible, by unleashing the forces associated with individual directed freedoms. You arrive at an outcome that is ultimately good for everyone. What I want to do is suggest that we might want to reframe that vision, that might not be the right vision. But pause for a second and think what it means to disagree with that. How could anyone disagree and say that you prefer enslavement over freedom? How could anyone say you prefer social and group repression over individual empowerment? Surely any political elites who argue that must be arguing that to benefit themselves. They must be extractive elites who are destructive of society, expropriating that nation's wealth for their own well-being. And removal of individual empowerment surely leaves the ordinary citizen defenseless against the ravages of this rapacious elite. Okay. So reframing the world, if we move away from this endpoint of humanity's ideological evolution, can't be the right step to take. Okay. And that's where I left university. And I decided to see, I looked around and tried to see how the world actually operated. Because you see, in this accounting, something has gone very wrong with the world. And those some things that have gone very wrong with the world, on the one hand, are actually quite happy things. Because part of this idea that we had reached the endpoint of ideological human evolution was that no other system outside of the heart of modern liberal democracy combined with free market capitalism, with individual empowerment, no other system could work. The happy outcome is that actually lots of systems seem to work. China, with a system that's very different, lifted over 600 million people out of extreme poverty in the last 4 decades. Its size is such that it has already overtaken the United States, the source of this vision. Even though its own system is very different, it's overtaken the United States already in so-called purchasing power parity. But if you think that it is just size that made this happen, consider the case of Singapore, which has a system very different from the characterization that I offered a few minutes ago. Singapore's per capita GDP is now higher than that of the United States. And it's not just China and Singapore. Everybody in between, outside of the Western liberal orbit, has had a pretty good showing. The emerging nations, all 150 of them, throughout the 1990s, had a total combined GDP of less than 35% that of the advanced Western economies. 35%. But in the 20 years after that, by 2016, the emerging world had caught up in parity with the advanced Western economies. Now, all of this is a good thing. That vision, that liberalization promise had been proven wrong is fine with us because the world is a better place as a result of it. But that's not, of course, the only thing that's happened. As the world's economic center of gravity shifted as a result of the changes in China, changes in Singapore, changes throughout the emerging world, something else is also happening. And this, not in such a happy way, is happening in an ugly way. The heart from which emerged this narrative of how we run the world has turned cold. It has turned in on itself. 2 weeks after the Brexit referendum, when British voters decided to leave the European Union and leave behind a narrative of openness, of transparency with the rest of the world, 2 weeks after that vote showed that Britain was exiting, hate crimes against foreigners rose 42% over the period a year before then. 2 days ago, an innocent Polish man talking on his telephone in Polish was set upon by British teenagers. The end of a string of attacks against foreigners. The West, Britain, despite this wonderful narrative of being open, of individual empowerment, of creating free systems, has turned against that. To a point where the United Nations asks, what has Britain done to cause this invective of hate? And I don't need to tell you that in the other center of liberal democracy, free market capitalism, things are even uglier. Where do we go from here? The world has turned completely upside down. Reframing the world is no longer off the table. I think what has happened is that the liberalization promise has been turned into delusion. And we've been deluded in 3 ways. The first way is the idea that by creating something that was open and free, and by empowering individuals and allowing them to engage one with the other, the net result would be something that delivered the greatest good to the highest number in society. And you know what? I remembered that I am in a profession that teaches exactly that idea. Economics teaches exactly that idea. But here's the thing. In economics, we have something called Adam Smith's invisible hand that tells us when individuals engage in society through open free markets and they're free to pursue their goals in an individually empowered way, Adam Smith's invisible hand does deliver all those goodies. Here's the problem. It is an invisible hand in economics, not in politics. And our politicians who have told us that by endowing each of us simply with individual freedoms in a liberal open society, that will bring about the greatest good for the greatest many, greatest number, well, they might still be right, but there's no theorem that says that. The second thing we have to think about is that this narrative has been constructed actually in a way that's deeply undemocratic. If you ask yourself, where in the world, and here I'm coming very close to Parak's construction of maps, I too went and looked at every single one of the 7 billion people we have on Earth, and I put them on the planet. And I asked where, having located these 7 billion people, is the smallest circle you can draw that has a simple democratic majority. That ought to be where we construct the narratives that reframe the world. The answer to that is here. If you go to a town called Mongket in eastern Myanmar and you draw a circle 3,300 kilometers in radius around it, that's a tiny circle. It comprises only 1/6 of the world's land area. It is nowhere near where we have constructed these grand narratives for how we as individuals engage with one another, how nation states engage with each other, construct domestic polities. This is a part of the world that carries the simple global democratic majority. And not a single person here, with the possible exception of maybe of Dean Kishore, has engaged in a serious way with the kind of global policy making that all of us now need to be engaged with. That's my second point. My third point is that when we reframe the world and we rethink these fundamentals, we need to be completely open-minded about the principles that we take forwards. World leadership is up for grabs, and that's how we need to reframe the world. Thank you very much.